The day had finally arrived. Grace stood at the entrance of the church, ready to walk down the aisle to the love of her life. Her heart raced with excitement as she took in the beautiful scene before her. The guests seated in their finest attire, the church decorated with delicate flowers, the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. It was supposed to be the perfect wedding day, a day filled with love, joy, and celebration. But then, as Grace stepped forward, something stopped her. There, in the middle of the aisle, was her loyal German shepherd, Hugo. His body was unusually stiff, and when she tried to walk past him, he refused to move. First, Grace brushed it off. Maybe he's just a little anxious, she thought. After all, weddings could be overwhelming even for a dog. She gently whispered to him, coaxing him to let her through. But Hugo didn't budge. There was no wagging tail, no playful glance, just an intense stare that made Grace's heart skip a beat. The room, once filled with soft chatter and laughter, fell into an uncomfortable silence. The guests watched, sensing the tension in the air. Grace's heart sank as she stood frozen in the aisle, trying to figure out what was happening. This wasn't like Hugo. He had always been by her side, her protector and companion through every joyful and difficult moment. Why was he acting like this now? The cheerful music that had been playing in the background seemed to fade into nothing, as an unsettling feeling began to creep into Grace's chest. The wedding she had dreamed of, the moment she'd waited for, was suddenly turning into something more serious. Something was terribly wrong. What was Hugo trying to tell her? As Grace knelt down in front of Hugo, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The look in his eyes, the way his body trembled beneath her touch. This was no longer just nerves. His breathing was shallow, each intake a strained effort, and his legs quivered as though he could barely hold himself up. Grace's hand moved to Hugo's graying muzzle, stroking it gently as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had been so focused on the wedding, on the day she had dreamed of, that it had never occurred to her that something could be so terribly wrong. But now, it was clear. Hugo, her constant companion for over a decade, was in distress. The strong, loyal dog who had always been by her side during every chapter of her life, whether through heartbreak, triumph, or joy, was now in pain. Her heart tightened, and panic slowly crept in. "Grace, we need to get moving," her father urged, his voice tinged with impatience. He had already moved to take the leash from Hugo, eager to get the ceremony back on track. But when Hugo let out a low growl, a sound Grace had never heard from him in all the years they had spent together, her father hesitated. The growl was quiet, but its weight was heavy. Grace felt it in the pit of her stomach. In that moment, a flood of memories came rushing back. Hugo as a scruffy puppy, trembling in fear during a thunderstorm, seeking solace in her arms. Hugo standing vigil during some of her toughest heartbreaks, offering quiet comfort without words. Hugo running beside her the day she met Lucas, joyfully bounding through the park. He had been there through every chapter of her life, and now, she realized, maybe for the first time, just how deeply tied their lives had been. She wasn't just losing a pet. Hugo was family. Tears threatened to spill as Grace stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of her realization. The wedding, her dress, the guests, they all seemed so far away, insignificant in this moment. She looked at Lucas, who had been quietly standing by her side, watching her with concern but saying nothing. Grace turned to him, her voice firm despite the storm inside. "We're going to the vet. The wedding can wait." Without hesitation, Lucas nodded, his support unwavering. "You don't need to apologize. Hugo comes first." It was a decision that shook Grace to her core, but she knew it was the right one. As she helped Hugo stand, the weight of the moment became crystal clear. Today wasn't about the wedding or the celebration. It was about her loyal dog, who had given her so much love and support, needing her just as much now. The guests stared, stunned and confused, as Grace, still in her wedding dress, led Hugo out of the church, with Lucas following close behind, phone in hand to arrange for the emergency vet. Her heart ached with every step, but she couldn't stop. She had to make sure Hugo was okay. This was the real moment that mattered. Everything else could wait. The car sped through the streets, tires squealing against the asphalt, but Grace could barely feel the motion. Her focus was solely on Hugo, who lay on the back seat, his breathing still shallow and strained. Lucas sat next to her, his hand resting gently on hers, providing a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The wedding dress, now wrinkled and smudged with dirt, felt like it didn't even belong to her anymore. This day, this moment, wasn't about the gown or the celebration. It was about Hugo, her loyal companion of 13 years, whose life was slipping through her fingers. Grace held Hugo's head gently in her lap, her fingers stroking the graying fur on his muzzle as tears silently spilled down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them. The tears weren't just for the wedding that was slipping away. They were for the dog who had always been there. He had shared every triumph and every heartbreak, and now he was struggling, fighting for every breath, and she couldn't help him. Or could she? Her thoughts swirled as she watched the world blur past the window. Had she missed the signs earlier? Could she have known this was coming? Grace's mind raced, retracing every moment over the past week. The signs that seemed like nothing more than stress. Wedding chaos, was that all it was? Or had something been wrong all along? Lucas, sensing her panic, reached over and squeezed her hand, his voice calm but firm. You couldn't have known, Grace. What matters is you're here now, and you're getting him the help he needs. His words, steady and full of support, were like a balm to her frayed nerves. The road ahead was uncertain, but Lucas was right. They couldn't change what had already happened. They could only focus on what they could control now. Getting Hugo to the vet. Minutes felt like hours, and the weight of Hugo's labored breaths in her lap was like a heavy stone in her chest. But finally, the clinic came into view, the warm lights of the parking lot a beacon in the night. Grace's heart skipped a beat as they pulled into the lot. Dr. Peterson, Hugo's longtime vet, was already waiting outside. The familiar, comforting presence of the vet calmed Grace slightly as she rushed out of the car, her wedding dress trailing behind her, forgotten in the rush. With Lucas close behind, Grace carefully lifted Hugo from the back seat, feeling the weight of his body in her arms. His once strong frame felt fragile now, as though the dog she had known for so long was slipping away from her with every passing second. Grace took a deep breath, bracing herself for what came next. She entered the clinic, feeling a mixture of dread and hope battling inside her. Dread, because she feared what Dr. Peterson might say, but hope, because Hugo wasn't alone. He was with her, and she would do everything she could to make sure he was okay. The soft hum of the vet clinic's lights filled the room as Dr. Peterson carefully examined Hugo. The silence between them was heavy, each second ticking by with an unbearable weight. Grace held her breath, watching intently, her heart in her throat. She could feel the heat of Hugo's body in her hands, and yet, despite the steady rise and fall of his chest, everything felt wrong. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. Finally, Dr. Peterson looked up from his examination with a look of quiet sympathy in his eyes. Grace's breath hitched as the words she feared most escaped his lips. Hugo is in advanced heart failure, he said softly, his voice full of compassion. While he's not in pain, his time is limited. The stress of the day, the excitement, the chaos, has only worsened his condition. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Grace felt as if the room had closed in around her, her breath catching in her chest. For all the years they'd shared together, for all the moments she had relied on Hugo, she wasn't ready to hear this. She wasn't ready to face the fact that the dog who had been by her side through every up and down was now nearing the end of his journey. Her heart cracked as she gazed at Hugo, who, though weak, still looked up at her with those loyal, amber eyes. He was still here, but she now knew their time together was running out. Grace's hands trembled as she stroked his fur, her voice barely a whisper. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't know. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned to Lucas, her voice breaking. Lucas stood beside her, his steady presence grounding her. Without a word, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with love and understanding. "You couldn't have known, Grace," he said softly, his voice strong and comforting. "You've always been there for him, and now he needs you more than ever." Grace nodded slowly, her chest tightening as the weight of the truth settled in. Hugo's time with them was coming to an end, and there was nothing she could do to change it. All she could do now was be with him, cherish whatever time was left, and make him feel as loved as he had made her feel all these years. She turned back to Hugo, her tears falling freely now. "I'll be with you, boy," she whispered, her voice filled with raw emotion. "You're not alone. Not now, not ever." As Lucas held her hand, the couple stood united, knowing that they were facing the heartbreaking reality of saying goodbye to Hugo, but together, they would make sure he felt the love and care he deserved until the very end. The air in the vet clinic was thick with emotion, as Grace and Lucas sat in silence, grappling with the weight of the moment. The reality of Hugo's condition had sunk in, and yet, amid the sadness, something began to shift. The door to the clinic opened softly, and Grace's parents entered, followed by Sophie, her maid of honor. They had come, not to judge, but to support her through this difficult time. Her mother, usually the picture of composure, had tears in her eyes as she stepped forward, offering a comforting embrace. "We thought you might need us," Grace's father said, his usual strength softened by the gravity of the situation. Their presence, their unwavering love, brought a sense of calm to Grace, grounding her amidst the whirlwind of emotions. Then, surprisingly, the minister entered. He had followed, sensing that this day, this wedding, had taken an unexpected turn. "If you're willing," he said gently, "we can still hold the ceremony here, right now, with Hugo by your side." Grace blinked, momentarily stunned. The thought of going ahead with the wedding, in this very room, amidst the uncertainty and heartbreak, felt impossible at first. But as she looked at Lucas, then at Hugo, lying quietly at their feet, something inside her clicked. This wasn't just about the wedding she had dreamed of. It was about the love that had always been there, love for Hugo, for Lucas, for family, and the need to honor that love in this very moment. After a brief pause, filled with the weight of the decision, Grace nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Let's do it here, with Hugo by our side." The clinic, normally a place of sadness, now transformed into something extraordinary. The lights above, the sterile walls, the scent of antiseptic, all seemed to fade into the background as Sophie adjusted Grace's wedding dress and Lucas straightened his rumpled tuxedo. Despite the circumstances, there was a sense of peace settling in the room, a quiet realization that this, in its own way, was the wedding that truly mattered. With Hugo lying at their feet, Grace and Lucas exchanged vows, not in the grandeur of a cathedral or a fancy reception hall, but in the intimacy of a vet clinic, surrounded by those who mattered most. As they spoke their promises to each other, Hugo let out a soft woof, his tail giving a faint, approving wag. It was as if he, too, understood the significance of this moment, his presence grounding the ceremony in a way that words could never express. This wasn't the wedding they had planned, with its grand decorations and flowing champagne, but it was a wedding that was even more special, one built on love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond of family. In that moment, Grace and Lucas realized that the true essence of their commitment was not defined by the setting or the ceremony. It was defined by the love they shared, the life they had built together, and the strength of the love that surrounded them. As the ceremony ended, the quiet joy of the moment settled in. It wasn't the day they expected, but it was the day they needed. And in the days that followed, as they held each other and Hugo, Grace and Lucas knew that this simple ceremony, with Hugo present, had been the most meaningful celebration of all. The night after the wedding felt like a dream, a mix of love, loss, and a quiet sense of peace. Grace and Lucas sat on the floor of their apartment, still in their wedding clothes, surrounded by the remnants of a simple takeout meal. Hugo lay between them, his head resting comfortably in Grace's lap, his breathing slow but steady. There were no grand speeches, no clinking glasses or dancing. The reception they had once imagined was replaced with something far more meaningful. The warmth of Hugo's presence, his unwavering loyalty, was the most powerful celebration of all. As they sat there, in the stillness of their apartment, they reflected on the events of the day, the unexpected turn of the ceremony, the moments of joy, and the overwhelming sense of love that filled the room. Grace looked at Lucas, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "It wasn't the wedding we planned," she said, her fingers gently stroking Hugo's fur, "but it feels more right than anything I ever imagined." Lucas smiled, his eyes soft as he nodded in agreement. "It's perfect, Grace. We didn't need all of that. We just needed each other." And Hugo, the weight of the moment settled between them, and in the quiet of the evening, it became clear that the day's events had shifted something within them. They had always known love, but today, they had truly understood what it meant. Loyalty, sacrifice, and the willingness to put those you love above everything else. But as the days turned into weeks, the bittersweet reality of Hugo's condition grew harder to ignore. The joyful moments spent together were now mixed with the slow decline of the dog they had always counted on to be strong. Some days, Hugo seemed to be his old self, his tail wagging as he trotted alongside Grace during walks, his eyes bright with affection. But on other days, the struggle was visible. The joy in his eyes was dimmed, and the once strong legs that had carried him through so many adventures now trembled with weakness. Through it all, Grace and Lucas adapted, adjusting to Hugo's changing needs, staying close, and showering him with the love he had always given them. They found new ways to make him comfortable, bringing him his favorite treats, offering him extra cuddles, and taking those precious moments to treasure the time they had left. They didn't know how much time they had, but every second with Hugo was a gift. In the midst of the uncertainty, Grace and Lucas knew one thing for sure. They would cherish every moment, because love, as they now understood, wasn't measured by time. It was measured by how deeply you lived it. The morning sun shone softly through the window, casting a warm glow on the room where Grace and Lucas sat with Hugo. It was a peaceful spring day, one that felt both like a blessing and a heartbreak. Hugo, once full of energy, now lay quietly at their feet, his breathing steady but slow. There was a calmness about him, a quiet understanding in his amber eyes that told Grace and Lucas it was time. That morning, they had made a promise to themselves and to Hugo that they would fill his final hours with love and comfort. They spent the day doing all the things Hugo loved, lounging together in the sun, his favorite treats in hand, soft whispers of gratitude escaping their lips as they stroked his fur. Every touch, every word, was a farewell, but also a celebration of the life he had shared with them. Grace gently cupped Hugo's face in her hands, looking into his eyes, fighting back the tears. "Thank you, Hugo," she whispered, "for everything. You were the best boy." Lucas, ever the steady presence, sat beside her, his arm around her, holding Hugo close. "You gave us so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll never forget you." The day passed quietly, the three of them together, savoring the moments, knowing that this would be the last time they would be with him in this way. Hugo seemed at peace, surrounded by the people who had loved him unconditionally. And when the time finally came, it was gentle, almost serene. In their arms, Hugo peacefully drifted into sleep, his final breath soft and slow. It wasn't the goodbye they had ever wanted, but it was the one that felt right. Surrounded by love, Hugo passed away, leaving behind a space that could never be filled. In the weeks that followed, Grace and Lucas reflected on the lessons Hugo had taught them. He had shown them what true loyalty meant, what it meant to love without hesitation, and the beauty of living in the moment. Hugo had given them the gift of being fully present, of appreciating every second, no matter how fleeting. Their grief was deep, but it was tempered with gratitude. They honored Hugo's memory not just with tears, but with the commitment to live fully and love fiercely, just as he had. Though Hugo was no longer physically with them, his presence lingered in every corner of their home. In the quiet spaces, in the places they had shared walks, in the warmth of their hearts. His love, a love that transcended time and space, would forever remain with them. The absence of Hugo in their home was a quiet ache that never truly faded. Grace and Lucas found themselves in a space that felt both too empty and too full. The love they had for Hugo remained, and it always would, but life continued, and they knew they had to find a way to heal. It was a simple idea, one that came from a place of longing, to give love again. And so, they found themselves at the local shelter, surrounded by wagging tails and hopeful eyes. The air smelled of fresh straw and the soft scent of rain. The sound of gentle barking filled the space, each dog yearning for a new home, a second chance. And then, at the very end of the row, they saw him, a senior golden retriever lying on a worn blanket. His fur, a soft blend of gold and silver, shimmered gently as he lifted his head to meet their gaze. There was something in his eyes, a calm knowing, a connection that went beyond words. Grace felt it immediately, the same feeling she had when she first met Hugo all those years ago. It was as if time had folded back on itself, and this dog, this moment, was destined to be. "That's him," Grace whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "This is the one." The dog, whose name was Lucky, gave a slow, contented sigh, his tail wagging lazily, as though acknowledging the truth in her words. Lucas knelt beside him, offering a gentle scratch behind his ears. In that moment, Lucky's calm demeanor, his gentle presence, filled the space left behind by Hugo, and yet, he also created a new kind of peace. He was not here to replace Hugo, but to bring a new kind of love, one that was both familiar and fresh. "Welcome to the family, buddy," Lucas said, his voice soft, as he stood and looked at Grace. She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude, knowing that in Lucky, they were starting a new chapter, one that didn't erase the past but built on it. Over the next weeks, Lucky settled into their home, his warmth bringing a new sense of comfort to the empty spaces. With him, Grace and Lucas found healing. They walked through the parks where Hugo had once run, and though the memories of Hugo were still fresh, there was joy again. Lucky was not a replacement, he was his own being, with his own quirks, but he gave them the gift of laughter, of companionship, and of learning to love again. In honor of Hugo's memory, Grace and Lucas began to volunteer at the shelter, giving back to the community that had given them so much. Every time they walked through the shelter doors, they saw the faces of countless dogs waiting for their second chance. Just as Hugo had been waiting years ago, they gave their time, their love, and their care to those who needed it, knowing that the love they had for Hugo wasn't something that ended with his passing. It was something that could continue, something that could help others heal, too. Hugo would always hold a special place in their hearts, but through Lucky, they learned that the heart never truly runs out of room for more love. And in that love, in that healing, they found peace. The story concludes with Grace and Lucas embracing a new chapter in their lives, forever carrying the love Hugo had shown them. They come to understand that love isn't measured by time, but by how deeply it's felt and lived. Through Lucky, they begin to heal, finding joy and comfort once again. Yet, Hugo's memory remains an unbreakable part of their hearts. His love, loyalty, and lessons echoing through their lives, forever shaping the way they love and live. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more amazing tales. Your support keeps us going,